The town hall meetings in Ashford had always followed the same pattern. Every Thursday, the same faces filled the wooden chairs of the old brick courthouse, their murmurs blending into a low hum before the gavel called for silence. The mayor, Randall Pierce, would sit at the head of the long table, his polished expression betraying the certainty that nothing happening in this room could ever truly threaten his control. Proposals were presented, concerns were raised, and decisions, long since determined in backroom conversations, were merely made official. Among those with the most influence was Douglas Vance, the town's most ambitious developer. His name was stamped across half the new construction projects that had transformed Ashford in the past decade. Office spaces, apartment complexes, retail centers, all erected in the name of progress, all benefiting his growing empire. His projects had displaced family businesses, forced longtime residents to relocate, and steadily erased much of what old Ashford had once been. Yet few opposed him openly. He had money, influence, and a talent for making obstacles disappear. That night's agenda included his latest endeavor, a luxury shopping plaza in the heart of town. It was a project that would bring in more revenue, more tourism, and, most importantly, more power for Douglas. The final piece of land required for construction was a small, aging diner that had been family-owned for 3 generations. The owners had resisted selling, but everyone knew their resistance was futile. The town council, under the mayor's guidance, would approve the project. It was only a matter of time before the demolition crews arrived. The meeting was nearly routine, until an unfamiliar presence disturbed the well-worn predictability. In the last row of chairs sat a man no one recognized. He was older, his hair silvered with age, his face unreadable beneath the dim lighting of the chamber. He wore a simple dark suit, unremarkable except for its pristine condition. His posture was relaxed, his hands resting on his lap, and his gaze remained fixed on the proceedings without any sign of impatience or distraction. As the meeting progressed, members of the town council occasionally glanced in his direction, their expressions betraying quiet curiosity. This was not a town where strangers blended into the background. Everyone had a place, a purpose. An unfamiliar face, especially one that carried itself with such composed authority, was an anomaly. He had no notebook, no briefcase, nothing to suggest he was a journalist or businessman. He neither spoke nor reacted, offering no sign of approval or disapproval as Douglas detailed the supposed benefits of the new shopping plaza. The mayor continued through the agenda, his voice steady as he recited the necessary formalities. The town's economy would prosper, local jobs would be created, and progress would march forward. The council nodded in agreement, some absently, others with the careful enthusiasm of those who knew where their interests lay. Outside, the sky had darkened, the courthouse lanterns casting long shadows across the room. The evening was drawing to a close, the outcome as predictable as ever. Yet as the meeting ended and attendees began to rise from their seats, a quiet unease rippled through the room. The man in the back row remained seated for a moment longer than expected. His gaze, once unwaveringly fixed on the discussion, now shifted. He observed the crowd, his eyes moving deliberately, as though committing faces to memory. Then, without hurry, he stood. His movements were unhurried, his steps measured as he walked toward the exit. He did not engage with anyone, did not linger near the conversations that had sprung up in the aftermath of the meeting. As he disappeared into the night, the whispers began. No one had seen him enter, and no one had noticed him leave until now. There was no car that could be identified as his, no companion who had accompanied him. He had simply appeared and then vanished. By morning, the town was already buzzing with speculation. The man had been seen again, this time on Main Street, standing in front of the diner marked for demolition. He had remained there for nearly 10 minutes, unmoving, his eyes fixed on the old neon sign flickering in the dim morning light. No one had approached him. No one had dared to ask who he was or what he wanted. As the day went on, tension built beneath the surface of routine life. Business owners exchanged glances, their conversations drifting back to the man who had appeared without explanation. His presence had unsettled something, disturbed the careful balance that had kept certain powers in place for years. By the time the next town hall meeting arrived, a different atmosphere filled the room. The air felt charged with an undercurrent of unease, as though an invisible shift had taken place between the last gathering and this one. The mayor took his usual seat, but there was a stiffness to his posture. Douglas Vance entered with his usual air of confidence, yet his glances toward the back of the room betrayed something beneath the surface, something approaching caution. The man was there again, seated in the same spot, silent, observing. A subtle but undeniable shift had occurred. The certainty that had governed the town's affairs for so long had cracked, if only slightly. Douglas Vance, always so sure of himself, was no longer entirely at ease. And for the first time in years, there was the faintest possibility that something unexpected was about to happen. The following days passed with an uneasy quiet, though it was the kind that carried weight, pressing down on the town like the heavy air before a storm. The stranger had not spoken a word to anyone, yet his presence alone had disrupted the certainty that had governed Ashford for years. No one knew his name, his purpose, or what interest he had in the town's affairs. Yet speculation continued to grow. By now, nearly everyone had heard about his visit to the old diner. Some said he had simply stood there, taking in the sight of the faded red and white awning and the cracked pavement in front of the entrance. Others swore he had walked the perimeter of the property, inspecting it as though searching for something unseen. A few, the kind given to exaggeration, insisted he had looked up at the apartment above the diner's kitchen window and nodded, as if acknowledging an unseen presence. Regardless of what was true, one fact remained. He had returned for the second town hall meeting in a row. Douglas Vance noticed him the moment he entered the courthouse that evening. The developer had built a reputation on control, of land, of people, of outcomes. He was not a man given to superstition, nor did he waste time dwelling on the insignificant. And yet, something about the stranger unsettled him. He prided himself on knowing everyone of importance, anyone with the means or influence to affect his business. But this man, silent, composed, unshaken by the weight of the room, was an anomaly. Mayor Randall Pierce, too, had taken notice. As he settled into his seat at the head of the table, his usual confidence felt thinner, stretched taut over something deeper. The town hall had always been a place where decisions were presented as discussions, where opposition was tolerated only so long as it never truly threatened the outcome. But something about tonight felt different. It was a feeling he couldn't quite place, an unease that clung to the air like the lingering scent of a fire long since extinguished. The agenda was predictable. A few minor zoning adjustments, budget allocations for local projects, and then, at last, the final vote on the luxury shopping plaza. The project had been inevitable from the start, a carefully laid-out progression leading to this moment. The town's economy would grow, tax revenues would increase, and another piece of old Ashford would be erased. Yet as Douglas Vance prepared to present his final case, something in the air had shifted. The stranger in the back row remained still, but his presence felt heavier now, as though the weight of his silence was no longer passive but deliberate. Douglas cleared his throat, his voice steady but lacking its usual effortless confidence. He recounted the benefits of the project, the jobs it would create, the revenue it would bring in, the modernization of the town's infrastructure. His words were measured, precise, but for the first time, they carried an edge of defensiveness, as if he were arguing a case rather than simply stating a foregone conclusion. The townspeople listened, but their attention was divided. Many had begun stealing glances toward the back row, toward the figure whose very presence had injected an unfamiliar element into the proceedings. Even those who had previously accepted the project as inevitable now found themselves hesitating, questioning. Then, something even more unexpected happened. A council member who had always aligned with Douglas hesitated before speaking. His approval, typically swift and unwavering, came slower this time, his words carefully chosen rather than automatically given. Another member, an older man whose tenure on the council had always been defined by pragmatism rather than principle, shifted in his seat before nodding, his agreement delayed by a moment longer than usual. It was subtle, but undeniable. The unshakable certainty that had governed these meetings for years had begun to fray at the edges. The vote proceeded, and as expected, the majority still sided with Douglas. But the once unanimous support was no longer absolute. A single vote had shifted against him, a lone dissenting voice where there had never been one before. It was not enough to halt the project, not yet, but it was a crack in the foundation, a hairline fracture in what had once seemed indestructible. As the meeting adjourned, people rose from their seats, murmuring among themselves in hushed tones. Some avoided looking at the man in the back row altogether, as though afraid that acknowledging him might invite some unknown consequence. Others stole brief glances, hoping for some sign, some explanation. The stranger, however, remained as he had been, silent, unreadable, unmoved. Douglas Vance lingered near the door longer than usual, watching as people filed out into the cold night air. He was a man who thrived on control, yet for the first time in a long while, something beyond his grasp had entered his world. As the courthouse emptied, the stranger finally stood. His movements were slow, deliberate. He walked toward the exit, his gaze fixed ahead, offering no acknowledgement to those who now openly whispered about him. He stepped outside, disappearing into the quiet streets of Ashford, leaving behind only the lingering unease that had begun to take root in the minds of those who had witnessed him. By morning, new rumors had spread. The stranger had been seen again, but not in town. This time, he had been spotted near Douglas Vance's private development offices, standing outside, watching, waiting. The following morning, a thick fog clung to Ashford streets, dulling the colors of the town and swallowing sound before it could travel far. The air was dense with the kind of quiet that made people uneasy without knowing why. At Douglas Vance's development office, the atmosphere inside was just as heavy. His staff moved carefully, their conversations hushed, their glances quick and uncertain. Something had changed. Douglas sat at his desk, staring at the reports in front of him without truly seeing them. His mind was elsewhere, caught on a detail that refused to be dismissed: the stranger. The way the man had sat through 2 town hall meetings, his presence a silent disruption to the usual rhythm of things. The way his name was unknown, his purpose unclear. The way, last night, he had been seen standing outside this very building. Douglas had built his success on confidence, on the unshakable belief that control was his to wield. He didn't allow distractions. He didn't tolerate interference. Yet this man, without saying a single word, had unsettled something deep within him. And Douglas knew better than anyone that unexplained disruptions were dangerous. By mid-afternoon, rumors had reached every corner of town. People whispered in cafes, in grocery store aisles, in the post office lines. Some claimed the man had been seen outside the diner again that morning, standing in the same spot as before, watching the old building as if it held some long-forgotten secret. Others insisted he had walked the length of Main Street, his eyes moving over the buildings with the slow, deliberate gaze of someone taking inventory of something that didn't belong to him. What no one knew, what no one had seen, was where he went at night. He had no known residence, no hotel stay registered in town, no car that anyone had seen him drive. It was as if he simply appeared when he wanted to be seen and vanished when he did not. By evening, the tension had deepened. Douglas had spent the day making phone calls, reaching out to contacts who might know something, anything, about the man. But no information came. He wasn't on any official town records, wasn't a property owner, wasn't connected to any existing businesses. He was, as far as anyone could tell, a ghost. Frustration gave way to action. That night, after locking his office, Douglas drove toward the diner himself. He needed to see it for himself, to stand where the stranger had stood. He needed to understand why this man had fixated on a place that, until now, had been nothing more than another obstacle in his path. The diner sat at the edge of town, its neon sign flickering weakly against the dark. The building was old but sturdy, the kind of place that had been patched up more times than anyone could count. For decades, it had been a gathering spot, a place where families had breakfast and old friends met for coffee. But it had no real future, not anymore. It was a relic of a past Ashford, one that had been slowly eroded by progress. Stepping out of his car, Douglas felt the weight of the night press down on him. The streets were empty. The only sound was the low hum of the streetlight above. He took a slow breath, scanning the area, expecting nothing. Then, he saw him. Across the street, Standing beneath the dark awning of an abandoned storefront, the stranger was watching. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them felt smaller than it was, the silence heavier than it should have been. The man's posture was relaxed, his expression unreadable. He stood as if he belonged there, as if he had been standing there forever. Douglas had faced rivals, had negotiated deals with men far more powerful than himself. But this wasn't business. This wasn't a competitor or an investor or a politician. This was something else entirely, something that shouldn't have mattered but did. He forced himself to turn away, to break the moment before it could sink deeper into his bones. Without another glance, he walked toward the diner. The front door was locked, but he had been given a key by the town council after they had finalized the paperwork. Soon, the building would belong to him entirely, just like so many others before it. He stepped inside, the scent of coffee and old wood filling the air. The space was quiet, untouched since its closure weeks ago. Booths lined the walls, tables still set with sugar dispensers and faded menus. In the dim light, the past felt close, as if the diner had been waiting for someone to return. He walked through the space, trailing his fingers along the countertop. It was just a building, he told himself, just another piece of real estate. The hesitation he felt was nothing more than the weight of the past, the residue of something that no longer mattered. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement outside. Turning sharply, he looked through the large front window. The stranger was gone. The street was empty once more, but the weight of his presence lingered, thick in the air. Douglas exhaled slowly. He had spent his life carving out his own path, ensuring that no one, not town officials, not stubborn property owners, not competitors, could ever dictate his future. He had learned that success belonged to those who were willing to take it, and weakness was simply an opportunity for others to seize control. Yet as he stood in that empty diner, the silence pressing in, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. A question, and he had no answer for it. The next morning, Douglas Vance arrived at his office earlier than usual. The fog had lifted, but the air still carried the weight of something unseen, something unresolved. He sat at his desk, his fingers drumming against the polished wood as he stared at the file in front of him. The final paperwork for the luxury shopping plaza. Everything was in order. The diner's demolition was scheduled. Soon, the building would be gone, erased like so many before it. And yet, the stranger's presence still lingered in his mind. Douglas had spent the night replaying the events in his head. The town hall meetings, the way the man had watched him, the silent confrontation outside the diner. It was irrational, he told himself. A nameless old man standing in the shadows shouldn't matter. And yet it did. By midday, another rumor spread through town. The stranger had been seen again. This time, not on Main Street, not outside the diner, but near Douglas's home. A quiet neighborhood on the west side of town, far from the courthouse, far from any place a man like that had any reason to be. This was no coincidence. Douglas drove home faster than usual, his pulse quickening as he turned onto his street. His house stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, a modern build surrounded by neatly trimmed hedges and a tall iron gate. It was a place designed for security, for privacy, a place where he controlled who entered and who did not. Yet as he pulled into the driveway, his breath caught. The stranger was there, standing just outside the gate, hands in the pockets of his dark suit, waiting. Douglas stepped out of his car, his movements slow, measured. He approached the gate but didn't open it. The two men stood separated by iron bars, the silence stretching between them. Then, for the first time, the stranger moved. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. Without a word, he extended it, slipping it through the gap between the bars. Douglas hesitated. Then, finally, he took it. The man didn't wait for a reaction. He simply turned and walked away, his steps unhurried, disappearing down the street just as quietly as he had arrived. Douglas unfolded the paper with steady fingers. At first, the writing meant nothing. It was an old land deed, one he had never seen before. The date was faded, the ink smudged in places. But the name on it struck him like a blow to the chest. Elliot Vance, his father. Douglas felt the world shift beneath him. His father had never been a wealthy man. He had worked in construction, moving from job to job, never settling long enough to build something of his own. Douglas had spent his life believing his success had come from nothing, from struggle, from ambition, from carving out his own place in the world. But this document said otherwise. Elliot Vance had owned that diner. The realization settled in like cold steel. The building he had spent months trying to demolish, the project he had fought so hard to push through. It wasn't just another property. It was his father's. And the stranger, the man who had sat in the back row, who had watched in silence, who had appeared and disappeared like a shadow, had known all along. Douglas clenched the paper in his hand, his breath unsteady. He had built his life on control, on power. But this wasn't something he could manipulate or erase. For the first time, he understood. The stranger hadn't come to fight him. He hadn't come to stop the project. He had come to remind him who he was. And Douglas Vance, a man who had spent his life believing he had left the past behind, suddenly found himself staring into the one thing he could never outrun, his own history. And it had been watching him all along. The paper trembled slightly in his grip as he reread the name. His father's name, the faded ink preserving a truth he had never known. The past was supposed to be something he had moved beyond, something irrelevant compared to the empire he had built. He had worked for years to distance himself from that life, from the uncertainty, from the struggle of a man who had spent his days working under the sun with nothing to show for it in the end. But this changed everything. Douglas turned, walking inside his house without even locking the gate behind him. He moved like a man untethered, as if each step took him further from the life he thought he had built. In his study, he spread the paper across his desk, smoothing it down with both hands. It wasn't just the deed that unsettled him. It was the implications. His father had owned that diner. And yet, Douglas had never known. His father had never spoken about it, had never once mentioned that a piece of Ashford had once belonged to him. If that was true, what had happened to it? Had he sold it? Lost it? Had it been taken from him the way Douglas had taken so many properties from others? The questions spiraled in his mind, each one unraveling another thread of certainty. He had always believed his rise to power had been a battle won against an indifferent world, that he had built his fortune on nothing but his own determination. But now he couldn't be sure. Because if his father had owned that land, then his past wasn't as distant as he had believed. The very thing he had spent his life tearing down, replacing, erasing, it had been his all along. And someone had known. The stranger hadn't just been watching. He had been waiting. Douglas pushed away from his desk and stood abruptly, his pulse quickening. He needed answers. He needed to know who the man was, why he had come to Ashford, why he had given him this paper. It wasn't random. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone had kept this from him, and someone had decided it was time for him to know. He grabbed his keys and left without hesitation. By the time he reached Main Street, the air had turned thick again, the early evening dimming faster than usual. The diner stood where it always had, its windows reflecting the amber glow of the streetlights. It looked different now, less like an obstacle and more like something else entirely. A monument to a history he had never been allowed to know. The street was quiet, but Douglas knew better than to trust its emptiness. He stepped forward, and he knew, without looking, that someone was watching him, somewhere in the shadows, waiting for him to finally understand.